Welcome to Amy Surratt's Tales from Tomorrow. Brought to you by the Asteroid Miners Guild of Sol 3, the Sparkly Rock Corporation, the League of Exquisite Toastery Bistros, and generous listeners like you, all around the planet Earth.
The house on Oakhaven's periphery did not so much stand as it did lean, a skeletal Victorian monstrosity that seemed to be slowly surrendering to the gravitational pull of the damp earth beneath it. For Elias Vance, the property was less a home and more a physical manifestation of a slow-motion collapse. The wallpaper in the parlor hung in jaundiced strips, revealing the grey, rotting lath beneath like exposed ribs. Every window frame was swollen with moisture, the glass clouded by a permanent film of grime that filtered the sunlight into a sickly, underwater hue. Elias sat in a velvet armchair that smelled of wet dogs and ancient tobacco, staring at a stack of final notices that had become the primary decoration of his coffee table. He was a man who had once lived for the soaring, melancholic arcs of a cello's C-string, but the music had stopped years ago, replaced by the rhythmic thrum of litigation and the silence of an empty bank account. He had reached a state of existence that transcended mere depression. He had achieved a crystalline, aggressive apathy. The house was the only thing he had left, and it was currently trying to eat itself. A wet sliding sound echoed from beneath the floorboards, a sound like a heavy slab of raw meat being dragged across a concrete slab. It was a sound that would have sent any sane man screaming into the street, but Elias only sighed, the sound a long, rattling exhale that mirrored the wind whistling through the attic eaves. He stood up, his joints popping with a series of dry clicks. His movements were slow, devoid of urgency, as if he were moving through a medium denser than air. He made his way toward the kitchen, passing a mirror that reflected a man with hollow cheeks and eyes that looked like two burnt-out cigarettes. He didn't look at the reflection for long. There was nothing there that offered a return on investment. The basement door groaned on its hinges, a high-pitched shriek that tore through the silence of the house. Elias didn't flinch. He descended the wooden stairs, each step emitting a warning creak. The air grew colder with every inch of descent, shifting from the stagnant warmth of the upper floors to a sharp, metallic chill that tasted of copper and subterranean mold. At the bottom, the concrete floor was slick with a translucent film of moisture. A single naked light bulb hung from a frayed wire, casting a harsh, jittery yellow glow that failed to penetrate the far corners of the cellar. In the deepest recess, behind the rusted skeleton of an old water heater, something moved. It didn't walk, it undulated. The creature was a nightmare of biology, a spindly, translucent thing that looked as though it had been constructed from wet parchment and nerve endings. Its limbs were too long, possessing an extra joint that allowed them to fold in directions that defied Euclidean geometry. It had no eyes, only a series of pulsating slits along its pale, translucent cranium that glowed with a faint, sickly bioluminescence. Its skin was a shifting map of capillaries, pulsing in time with a heart that sounded like a distant, muffled drum. This was a skin crawler, a parasite from a fold in reality where the only currency was terror. For 3 weeks it had established a perimeter in Elias' basement. It had spent its nights testing the boundaries of the human psyche, manifesting as a distorted reflection in the laundry room mirror, or whispering in a voice that sounded like a loved one speaking through a mouthful of gravel. It operated on a strict cosmic clock, the 1:00 a.m. rule. At exactly 1 in the morning, the creature was permitted to emerge from the shadows, to stalk the hallways, to exert its psychological pressure on the occupant of the house, and to feed on the resulting cortisol and dread. Elias checked his wristwatch. 1:02 a.m. The creature slid forward, its long, needle-like fingers clicking against the concrete. It rose to its full height, unfolding itself like a piece of origami made of raw flesh. It let out a low, vibrating hiss that rattled the pipes in the ceiling, a sound designed to trigger a primal flight response in the amygdala. It leaned into the light, its featureless face hovering inches from Elias' own. Elias didn't move, he didn't even lean back, he simply looked at the entity with an expression of profound, clinical boredom. "You're late," Elias said. His voice was flat, a monotone that lacked any trace of the fear the creature required to sustain itself. "And you're dripping on the floor again. I just swept that area on Tuesday." The skin crawler paused. The pulsing slits on its head flickered rapidly, a sign of confusion. The creature's entire existence was predicated on the reaction of its prey. It fed on the spike of adrenaline, the widening of the pupils, the erratic heartbeat of a terrified human. But Elias' heart was beating with the steady, sluggish rhythm of a man who had already lost everything he valued. There was no fear to harvest, only a weary, crushing sense of annoyance. The entity attempted a different tactic. It shifted its form, its skin rippling and bubbling until it resembled a distorted version of Elias' own father who had died a decade ago. The face was almost perfect, save for the eyes, which remained those pulsing, bioluminescent slits. Elias, it whispered, the voice a perfect mimicry of a dead man's tenderness. Why are you alone in this rotting place? Come, join me in the dark. Elias stared at the facsimile of his father. He didn't weep, he didn't wrinkle. He simply reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a small spiral-bound notebook and a pen. Right, Elias muttered, scribbling something down. Emotional manipulation, low effort, derivative, 2 out of 10 for creativity. The mimicry collapsed. The creature snapped back into its original spindly form, emitting a shrill, clicking sound of frustration. It lunged forward, its long fingers snapping toward Elias' throat, stopping a fraction of an inch from his skin. The air around the claws shimmered with a necrotic energy, a promise of agonizing dissolution. Elias didn't blink. He looked at the claws, then looked back at the creature. You know, Elias said, his voice regaining a slight edge of calculation, I've been thinking about the square footage of this basement. About 48 square meters of usable space, including the alcove behind the heater. And you've been occupying a significant portion of that space for 21 days. The creature hissed, its jaw unhinging to reveal rows of needle-thin teeth. Now, Elias continued, ignoring the threat entirely. In this jurisdiction, the unauthorized occupation of residential property is known as squatting. I'm currently in a very precarious financial position, and I cannot afford to let any asset go unmonetized. Therefore, if you intend to continue residing in the southwest quadrant of my cellar, we need to discuss a lease agreement. The skin-crawler froze. The concept of a lease agreement was not present in its cosmic lexicon. It existed to hunt, to haunt, and to consume. It did not understand the concept of property law or financial obligation. I'm not asking, Elias said, his voice becoming sharper, adopting the tone of a man who had spent too many hours arguing with debt collectors. I'm informing you, you have 2 options. Option A, you vacate the premises immediately, which involves me calling an exorcist, who, granted, is expensive, but I'll bill the cost to your estate. Option B, you pay rent. The creature let out a guttural roar, the sound shaking the very foundations of the house. It slammed a limb against the concrete wall, cracking the cement with a thunderous boom. Elias didn't flinch, he simply pointed to the crack in the wall. That's property damage, Elias noted, writing in his notebook, adding a $500 repair fee to your initial balance. Now, since you obviously don't have currency, we'll have to negotiate a service-based exchange. I've noticed the laundry in the mudroom is piling up and the gutters are clogged with maple leaves. You have long limbs, don't you? Extremely flexible. The entity stared at him. The bioluminescent slits on its head were pulsing in a frantic, erratic rhythm. It felt a sensation it had never experienced in its eons of existence. It felt small. The creature was a predator of the mind, but it had encountered a man whose mind was a wasteland of apathy, a void more profound than the one the creature had crawled out of. The power dynamic had shifted. The predator was no longer the one in the shadows. The predator was the man with the notebook. Here are the house rules, Elias said, stepping closer, forcing the creature to retreat a few inches. First, no whispering in the hallways after midnight. It's disruptive to my sleep cycle. Second, no mimicking dead relatives unless it's for a specific, agreed-upon purpose. Third, the 1:00 a.m. rule is now a 2:00 a.m. rule. I need an extra hour of peace before you start your spooky antics. And finally, you will handle the trash bins every Tuesday morning. The skin crawler let out a low, mournful whine. It tried to manifest a terrifying image, a swarm of insects erupting from the floor, but Elias just sighed and pointed to the dust on the baseboards. While you're down here, you might as well wipe those down, Elias commanded. For a long minute, the creature remained motionless, its spindly frame trembling. It looked at the exit, the stairs leading up to the world of light and sound, and then it looked at the man. There was something about Elias Vance that was more terrifying than the void. It was the absolute, unwavering certainty of his indifference. To be hunted was one thing, to be managed was an existential horror the creature could not comprehend. Slowly, with a tentative clicking motion, the creature reached out and touched a pile of discarded laundry nearby. "Good," Elias said, closing his notebook with a satisfying snap. "I'll draft the formal contract tonight. If you're diligent, I might let you use the dehumidifier for an hour a week. Now get to work, those gutters aren't going to clear themselves." Elias turned and walked back up the stairs, the thump-thump of his footsteps sounding like a victory march. As he closed the basement door, he could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a cosmic horror attempting to fold a fitted sheet. And for the first time in years, Elias Vance felt a glimmer of genuine satisfaction. He wasn't just surviving his bankruptcy, he was diversifying his portfolio. The nursery was a sanctuary of soft edges and low-frequency hums, bathed in the dim amber glow of a salt lamp that cast long, distorted shadows across the cream-colored walls. A white noise machine sat on the changing table, churning out a steady, artificial rain that was meant to soothe the occupants of the twin cribs. But to Arthur Penhaligon, it sounded like a drilling rig operating inside his skull. Arthur stood in the doorway, his frame slumped, his shoulders rounded like a man carrying an invisible slab of granite. He had not slept in 72 hours. The world had ceased to be a place of solid objects and coherent timelines. Instead, it had become a shimmering, unstable haze. His vision frayed at the edges, the periphery of his sight dancing with static-like sparks known as floaters, and his thoughts moved with the sluggish, heavy consistency of cold molasses. The air in the room smelled of sour milk, lavender-scented detergent, and the metallic tang of the 4 double espressos currently screaming through his nervous system. Every sound, the rhythmic tick-tock of the wall clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs, felt like a physical blow to his temples. In the cribs, the twins, Leo and Maya, were finally still. Their breathing was a fragile synchronized cadence, a precarious peace that Arthur guarded with the intensity of a sentinel at the gates of a holy city. He watched the slight rise and fall of their chests, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a raw, gritty exhaustion that felt like he had been rubbing sand into his corneas for days. Then the air in the corner of the room shifted. It didn't happen with a bang or a sudden gust of wind. Instead, the shadows simply deepened, curdling into a shape that was too long, too thin, and entirely wrong. A figure began to unfold itself from the darkness behind the rocking chair. It rose upward, its limbs elongating with a series of wet clicking sounds, extending until its head nearly brushed the ceiling. This was the tall man. To any other observer, it would have been a visual glitch, a blurred, smeary silhouette that defied the camera's focus. Its face was a smudge of grey, a featureless void where a nose and eyes should have been, as if someone had taken a thumb to a wet oil painting and smeared the features away. It didn't walk so much as it glided, the space between its movements skipping like a scratched DVD. The entity paused, its blurred head tilting at an unnatural angle. It began to project its signature frequency, a wave of primordial dread designed to trigger an immediate, paralyzing terror. It was a psychic scream, a vibration that whispered, "You are alone, you are weak, your children are vulnerable." Arthur didn't feel the dread. The fear center of his brain, the amygdala, had been rendered obsolete 3 days ago. It had been burned out by a relentless cycle of midnight feedings, diaper blowouts, and the sheer grinding attrition of infant care. In its place, something else had emerged, a raw, primal state of guardian delirium. As the tall man glided closer, its long, spindly fingers reaching out toward the cribs, Arthur's eyes didn't widen in horror. They narrowed, a sudden crystalline clarity pierced through the fog of his exhaustion. It wasn't the clarity of a sane man, it was the hyperfocus of a predator. The entity was a noise, the entity was a disturbance, the entity was a threat to the silence, and above all else, the entity was trying to wake the babies. Arthur moved, he didn't scream, he didn't gasp. He launched himself across the room with a burst of adrenaline that should have been physiologically impossible for a man in his state. He didn't run so much as he lunged, his movements jagged and explosive. The tall man, accustomed to victims who froze or fled, was momentarily stunned. It attempted to vanish, to slip back into the shadow realm, but Arthur's hand closed around the entity's wrist. The touch was like grabbing a handful of freezing needles and wet smoke, but Arthur's grip was an iron vice. He didn't care that the entity was an interdimensional horror. He didn't care that its skin felt like cold slime. He only cared that the creature had dared to disrupt the sanctity of the nap. "Do you have any idea?" Arthur whispered, his voice a low, guttural rasp that sounded like 2 stones grinding together. How hard it was to get them to sleep. The entity let out a distorted, echoing shriek, a sound that should have shattered the windows and sent Arthur into a state of catatonia. Arthur didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in, his face inches from the blurred smudge of the creature's head. The pupils of his eyes were pinpricks, surrounded by a sea of blood-red capillaries. There was a look in his gaze that the tall man had never encountered in all its eons of haunting. A look of pure, unadulterated, sleep-deprived rage. It was a predatory hunger that made the entity's own void seem shallow. "You think you're the monster in the room," Arthur hissed, his grip tightening until the entity's spindly arm began to warp and bend. "I haven't slept since Tuesday. I am operating on caffeine and spite. I have forgotten what a full night's rest feels like. I am currently a ghost in my own body and I have absolutely nothing left to lose." The entity struggled, its long limbs flailing, trying to push Arthur away. It attempted to project an image of a rotting corpse, then a swarm of spiders, then the heat death of the universe. Arthur simply stared through the illusions, his expression one of profound annoyance. "Shut up," Arthur commanded. The sheer force of the command, backed by the weight of a father's primal protective instinct, hit the entity like a physical blow. The tall man felt a sudden, sharp spike of something it had only ever caused in others: fear. It realized that it was no longer the apex predator in the nursery. It was merely a nuisance to a man who had evolved past the need for sleep and had entered a state of permanent combat-ready delirium. With a sudden, violent jerk, Arthur flung the entity backward. The tall man collided with the rocking chair, sending it crashing to the floor with a loud thump. Immediately, Maya stirred in her crib, letting out a small, tentative whimper. Arthur froze. The rage vanished, replaced instantly by a frantic, desperate need to maintain the peace. He spun around, his movements blurring, and began a rhythmic, desperate shushing sound, his hand hovering over the crib in a frantic, soothing motion. "Shush, shush, shush," he whispered, his voice trembling with the effort of being quiet. "Go back to sleep, baby. Daddy's got it. Just sleep. Please, for the love of all that is holy, just sleep." The tall man lay on the floor, its blurred form flickering violently. It looked up at Arthur, the man who had just manhandled a spectral entity with the casualness of someone moving a piece of furniture, and then it looked at the infants. It sensed the invisible tether between the man and the children, a bond of protective aggression so potent it acted as a physical barrier. The entity didn't try to haunt the room again. It didn't try to scream. It simply dissolved, its form collapsing inward until it was nothing more than a smudge of grey smoke that vanished into the vents. Arthur didn't even notice it was gone. He remained hunched over the crib, his eyes wide and staring, his breathing shallow. He stayed there for 20 minutes motionless until Maya's breathing returned to its deep, rhythmic cadence. Only then did he allow himself to lean back against the wall. He slid down the plaster until he was sitting on the floor, his head resting against the cool paint. He closed his eyes for a second, and for a brief, flickering moment, he thought he saw the tall man's blurred face in the darkness. Arthur didn't shudder. He didn't pray. He simply raised a middle finger toward the void and drifted into a 3-minute micronap that felt like a journey through 1,000 lifetimes. Clara Vale's studio was not a room so much as it was a crime scene of creative excess. Located in a converted textile mill with ceilings that vaulted 20 feet into the gloom, the space was a riot of clashing textures and aggressive colors. Half-finished sculptures made of rusted rebar and neon-pink yarn coiled like sleeping serpents across the floor, while canvases of staggering proportions leaned against the brick walls, covered in thick, impasto swirls of cadmium yellow and bruised violet. The air was a heavy, intoxicating cocktail of turpentine, linseed oil, and the metallic tang of spray paint. In the center of this chaos sat Clara, perched atop a stool that was essentially a modified tractor seat welded to a stack of old encyclopedias. She was currently staring at a blank canvas, her fingers stained an iridescent shade of teal, her hair a bird's nest of copper curls held back by a pair of oversized drafting goggles. For the last 2 weeks she had not been alone. The entity which Clara had internally named the Echo was a masterpiece of psychological predation. It didn't have a shape of its own. It was a shimmering, iridescent ripple in the air, a heat haze that manifested as a perfect auditory mirror. It fed on the predictable patterns of human grief and anxiety, sliding into the cracks of a person's psyche to whisper the things they most feared. It had spent the last hour mimicking the voice of Clara's estranged sister, Sarah. The voice was perfect, the same slight lisp on the sounds, the same rhythmic cadence of passive aggression, the same wounded tone that had defined their relationship for a decade. "You always did think you were the special one, didn't you, Clara?" the voice whispered, drifting from the rafters. It sounded as if it were standing right behind her ear, the breath cold and smelling of old ozone. "Hiding in this warehouse, pretending your little scribbles are art. Mom always knew you were just playing house with your sanity." Clara didn't flinch, she didn't even stop painting. She carefully applied a dot of neon orange to the center of the canvas. "The pacing is off," Clara remarked, her voice airy and detached. "You're leaning too hard into the resentful sibling trope. It's a bit cliché, don't you think? Where's the nuance? Where's the subtext? If you're going to haunt me as Sarah, you need to capture the way she used to chew her lip when she was lying. The current delivery is too theatrical." It's very community theatre in the worst way. The echo paused, the ripple in the air shuddered. The entity was used to tears. It was used to desperate pleas for forgiveness or screams of denial. It was not used to receiving a critique of its performance art. "I am the voice of your failures," the entity roared, the voice shifting instantly from Sarah to a booming, guttural bass that vibrated the floorboards. "I am the shadow of every regret you have ever buried. I will tear your mind apart piece by agonizing piece." Clara finally turned around. She didn't look terrified, she looked inspired. "Oh, now that is a choice," she exclaimed, leaping off her stool with a sudden kinetic energy. "That guttural shift, the sonic dissonance, that's the spark I've been looking for. You're not a demon, you're a living synthesizer. We can work with this." Before the entity could react, Clara lunged forward not to attack, but to grab a handheld recording device and a small battery-powered amplifier from her workbench. "Here's the deal, Echo," Clara said, her eyes gleaming with a manic creative light. "You want to play a psychological game? Fine, but I don't play by horror rules, I play by absurdist rules. From this moment on, we are engaging in a collaborative piece of performance art titled The Gaslighting of the Void." The entity attempted to manifest a terrifying image, a wall of screaming faces erupting from the floor. Clara immediately responded by cranking the amplifier to full volume and playing a recording of a slide whistle at 2x speed. The sound was a piercing, ridiculous whoop that sliced through the demon's atmospheric dread like a hot knife through butter. The screaming faces flickered, their expressions of agony momentarily replaced by confusion. The entity tried to regain control, shifting its voice to a weeping child, a sound designed to trigger an instinctive, protective panic. "Help me, it's so cold, why did you leave me?" Clara didn't skip a beat. She grabbed a bucket of glitter-infused acrylic paint and flung it upward with a wide, sweeping motion, coating the shimmering ripple of the entity in a sparkling, iridescent gold. "Now we're getting somewhere," she shouted, dancing in a circle around the bewildered demon. "Now let's contrast the existential dread with some high-energy chaos. Give me a scream, but make it sound like a dying seagull in a wind tunnel. Go." The echo was frozen. For the first time in its existence, it was encountering a mind that didn't possess a single predictable pattern. Fear was a frequency, and Clara Vale was a radio dial being spun randomly by a toddler. She wasn't fighting the entity, she was incorporating it into a fever dream. The entity tried to vanish, to retreat into the shadows, but Clara followed it, humming a dissonant tune and occasionally throwing a handful of confetti into the air. "Stop it," the entity shrieked, the voice now a chaotic blend of 5 different people. "Cease this madness. I am a predator. I am the bringer of despair." "You're a medium," Clara corrected, stopping abruptly to strike a dramatic pose. "And your range is limited. You're too predictable. You think darkness is scary." "Honey, I grew up in a house where the silence was louder than the screaming. You're an amateur. Now let's try this again. I want you to mimic the sound of a toaster popping, but I want it to convey a sense of deep romantic longing. Do it." The entity let out a sound that was half hiss, half sob. It began to flicker violently, its iridescent form becoming unstable. It was experiencing a cognitive collapse. Its entire biological imperative was to find a weakness and exploit it. But it had found nothing in Clara Vale except a bottomless pit of whimsical spite and an obsessive need for aesthetic novelty. The demon didn't just feel defeated, it felt cringe. It tried to manifest one last terrifying visage, a towering skeletal claw reaching for her throat, but Clara simply reached up, pretended to adjust the claw's composition by pushing it 2 inches to the left and muttered, "Better, but the lighting is all wrong. We'll fix that in post." The entity collapsed. The ripple in the air shivered one last time and then vanished, leaving behind only a faint smell of ozone and a lingering sense of profound embarrassment. Clara stood in the silence of her studio, the gold glitter still floating in the air like tiny fallen stars. She looked at her blank canvas and smiled. "A bit derivative," she whispered, picking up her brush, but the energy was there. As she returned to her painting, she didn't notice that the shadows in the corner of the room were no longer predatory. They were huddled, as if trying to hide from the woman who had turned a cosmic haunting into a critique of her artistic range. Clara Vale had not just survived the mimic, she had outweirded it. And in the silent, shivering void where the demon now resided, it began to wonder if humans were actually the ones who were insane. In the spaces between seconds where the physical world thins into a grey, humming void, the hollows convened. They did not communicate with words, for words were clumsy, linear things. Instead, they exchanged frequencies, jagged bursts of psychic dissonance and ripples of shared failure. The collective consciousness of the scouts was a storm of frustration. The spectral entity from St. Jude's, the skin crawler from the basement, the tall man from the nursery, and the mimic from the studio were no longer the predators. They were survivors of a series of inexplicable, humiliating defeats. To the hollows, the humans of Oakhaven had always been seen as soft, malleable things, creatures of fear and predictable trauma. But these 4, the matron, the landlord, the guardian, and the disruptor, were anomalies. They were glitches in the biological harvest. While the rest of the city was being successfully softened, these 4 had not only resisted the fear frequency but had somehow inverted it. They had projected their own internal chaos and rigidity onto the entities, effectively colonizing the paranormal. The collective reached a consensus. The individual approach had failed. The scouts were no longer sufficient. To break these 4, the hollows would need to synchronize. They would strip away the humans' anchors, the ward, the house, the nursery, the studio, and force them into a state of total disorientation. They began with the grid. It started at 11:14 p.m. A sudden, violent surge of necrotic energy pulsed through Oakhaven's electrical infrastructure. Transformers didn't just blow, they shrieked, the metal twisting into impossible shapes as the power died in a cascading wave. Streetlights flickered once, twice, and then vanished, plunging the city into a darkness that felt thick and predatory. The hum of the city, the distant roar of traffic, the buzz of neon signs, the rhythmic thrum of air conditioners, was replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a weight pressing against the eardrums. In the sudden black, the general population of Oakhaven succumbed to a choreographed panic. Doors flew open, people screamed into the void. The fear frequency, now amplified by the citywide blackout, began to feast on the collective anxiety of 10,000 terrified souls. But for the 4 apex humans, the blackout was merely an inconvenience. Margaret Thorne stood in the center of the St. Jude's corridor, her flashlight cutting a sharp, clinical beam through the dark. Beside her, the spectral entity, now wearing a makeshift apron made from a hospital sheet, was frantically trying to find the backup generator. "Stop fumbling with the switch, you overgrown piece of lint," Margaret barked, her voice echoing through the dead hallway. "If the refrigeration for the insulin fails, I am holding you personally responsible. Now move your translucent backside and get those lanterns lit." 3 blocks away, Elias Vance sat in his velvet armchair staring at the ceiling. He didn't move when the lights went out. He didn't move when the house began to groan with an unnatural, rhythmic pulse. He only looked at his wristwatch, which had stopped precisely at the moment of the surge. "Great," Elias muttered, his voice flat. "Oh, I can't run the dehumidifier. I hope you're happy, you parasitic squatter. This is coming out of your security deposit." From the depths of the basement, a muffled clicking sound of genuine distress drifted up through the floorboards. In the suburbs, Arthur Penhaligon had reacted with a precision that bordered on the robotic. The moment the lights died, he had already navigated the darkness of the nursery by memory, his hand clamped over the baby monitor to ensure the silence remained unbroken. He stood like a gargoyle at the foot of the cribs, his eyes scanning the room. He could feel the shift in the air. The tall man was back, and it wasn't alone. He could smell the ozone and the wet smoke of the void. Arthur didn't feel fear. He felt a simmering, incandescent rage that the blackout might trigger the twins' night terrors. He gripped a heavy, rubber-backed baby bottle in his hand like a tactical baton, his knuckles white. And in the textile mill, Clara Vale was delighted. atmospheric lighting. She shouted, her voice ringing through the cavernous studio. She began to dance in the dark, her movements erratic and joyful. The void is finally collaborating. I can feel the tension, the drama, the sheer theatricality of a citywide collapse. Echo, darling, are you seeing this? It's a masterpiece of urban decay. The shimmer in the air beside her flickered with a sense of profound exhaustion. Driven by a subconscious pull they couldn't explain, the four of them found themselves moving toward the center of the city. It wasn't a conscious choice, but a gravitational alignment. The hollows were trying to herd them, to bring the anomalies together in one place where they could be overwhelmed by a concentrated surge of psychic horror. They met at the Blue Plate, a 24-hour diner that served as the unofficial heart of Oakhaven. The diner was a relic of chrome and cracked vinyl, its neon sign now dead, leaving the interior illuminated only by the flickering emergency lights and the pale, ghostly glow of the street lamps that hadn't quite given up. Inside, a dozen terrified patrons were huddled together in the center of the room, whispering in panicked tones about the darkness and the things in the street. The door swung open and Margaret Thorne marched in, her white nursing clogs squeak-slapping against the checkered floor. She was wearing a heavy trench coat over her scrubs, her flashlight still clenched in her hand like a weapon. She scanned the room with a look of profound disapproval, her eyes landing on the huddle of panicked citizens. "Move aside, please," she commanded, her voice slicing through the whimpering. "Some of us have actual work to do." Seconds later, Elias Vance drifted in. He looked like a ghost himself, his oversized cardigan hanging off his frame, his eyes vacant and bored. He didn't look at the people, he looked at the menu board behind the counter, calculating the inflation rate of a midnight pancake special. Then came Arthur. He entered with a sudden, violent energy, his eyes darting around the room with the hypervigilance of a cornered animal. He was still wearing a stained World's Greatest Dad t-shirt, and there was a smudge of baby puree on his shoulder. He looked less like a man and more like a sleep-deprived combatant who had just stepped off a battlefield. Finally, Clara burst through the door, trailing a scarf of neon yellow silk and humming a dissonant tune. She was covered in gold glitter and smelled of turpentine. The four of them stopped. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another. The general public of the diner seemed to fade into the background, becoming nothing more than blurred shapes in the periphery. The silence between the four protagonists was not the silence of strangers. It was a recognition. Margaret looked at Arthur's bloodshot eyes and saw the reflection of her own relentless discipline. Elias looked at Clara's manic grin and recognized the same aggressive detachment he used to survive his own life. Arthur looked at Margaret and saw an authority that didn't flinch, and Clara looked at Elias and saw a void of apathy that she found aesthetically fascinating. They all saw it, the look. It was a specific, hardened quality in the eyes. It was the look of someone who had looked into the abyss and found it wanting. It was the look of a person who had stopped being the prey and had started being the problem. Outside, the shadows against the diner's windows began to thicken. The glass rattled as 100 unseen fingers tapped against the panes in a synchronized, rhythmic cadence. The air inside the diner grew cold, the smell of ozone and wet cardboard returning with a vengeance. The patrons screamed, diving under the booths. Margaret Thorne didn't even look at the window. She looked at the three strangers and sighed, a sound of genuine, weary frustration. "I assume," Margaret said, her voice echoing with clinical authority, "that your ghosts are also being incredibly inefficient tonight." Elias blinked, a slow, languid movement. "My squatter is currently having a nervous breakdown because I've threatened his security deposit. I assume you're talking about the same kind of atmospheric nuisance." Arthur shifted his weight, his grip tightening on the baby bottle in his pocket. "The thing in my nursery tried to wake my kids. I'm currently in a state of extreme irritability." Clara beamed, her eyes sparkling. "I've been using mine as a living synthesizer. Is this a support group? Because I feel like we have a lot to discuss regarding the lack of creativity in the current haunting season." As the windows of the diner shattered inward and the first wave of spectral entities poured into the room, the four of them didn't scream. They didn't run. They simply stood their ground, four broken, exhausted, and utterly terrifying humans looking at the monsters with an expression of shared, profound annoyance. The hollows had brought them together to break them. Instead, they had just created a committee. The glass did not simply break, it detonated. 1,000 diamond-sharp shards of tempered plate exploded inward, shimmering in the emergency lighting like a rain of frozen needles. Through the jagged apertures, the entities poured in, not as individual scouts, but as a cohesive, undulating wave of grey-black ichor and distorted limbs. They were amalgamations now, the hollows merging their forms into towering, multi-limbed horrors that resembled a collision between a deep-sea isopod and a charcoal sketch of a nightmare. Their faces were a chaotic mosaic of shifting features, eyes blinking in places where mouths should be, their voices a discordant choir of screams and whispers that tore at the air. The patrons of the diner were instantly consumed by the panic. A man in a flannel shirt tried to bolt for the kitchen, but a spindly, translucent limb whipped out from the ceiling, wrapping around his ankle with the speed of a snapping trap and yanking him upward into the darkness of the rafters. The screams of the terrified civilians acted like a dinner bell for the entities, the frequency of fear fueling their forms, making them denser, more physical, more lethal. Amidst the carnage, the 4 apex humans stood in a small, tight circle, an island of eerie calm in a sea of psychic violence. Absolutely unacceptable, Margaret Thorne declared. She didn't look at the screaming man in the rafters. She looked at the entities as if they were a group of unruly toddlers who had just overturned a tray of juice boxes. This is a public establishment. There are health and safety regulations. This is a flagrant violation of every zoning law in the tri-state area. A towering entity, its chest a yawning void of pulsing purple light, lunged at her. It moved with a sickening, twitching acceleration, its claws extending like obsidian razors. Arthur Penhaligon didn't think, he didn't calculate, he simply exploded. The Guardian's rage, previously a simmering ember, ignited into a white-hot inferno. He intercepted the creature mid-leap, his shoulder slamming into the entity's midsection with the force of a freight train. The impact sounded like a wet sack of concrete hitting a wall. Arthur didn't stop there, he grabbed the creature's elongated neck with both hands, his fingers digging into the translucent flesh with a strength born of 1,000 sleepless nights. "Get," Arthur roared, his voice a primal guttural sound that momentarily drowned out the choir of screams. "Out of my way." With a violent, twisting motion, he slammed the entity face first into a chrome counter, the metal buckling under the force. He didn't let go. He began to deliver a series of short, brutal punches to the creature's head, not the calculated strikes of a fighter, but the desperate, frantic blows of a father who had just found a spider on his baby's forehead. Each punch landed with a wet thwack, the entity's form flickering and destabilizing under the assault of a man whose brain had completely bypassed the concept of self-preservation. As Arthur held the line, the entities began to circle the group, sensing the anomaly. They realized that while the civilians were easy prey, these 4 were anchors of stability. The creatures began to synchronize their attack, weaving a web of psychological pressure, attempting to find the specific frequency that would break the humans. The air around the group began to thicken, the shadows twisting into personalized horrors. For Margaret, the room began to smell of failing lungs and sterile decay. For Arthur, the distant sound of a baby crying echoed from the darkness. "Oh, how quaint," Clara Vale remarked. She was standing on a vinyl booth, her neon yellow scarf fluttering like a signal flag. She watched the swirling shadows with a look of genuine academic curiosity. "They're trying to use personalized trauma triggers. It's so early 20th century, it's practically Victorian, it's absolutely derivative." Clara reached into her oversized art bag and pulled out a handheld air horn and a canister of industrial-grade reflective glitter. BWWWWAP. The blast of the air horn was a sonic spike that ripped through the entity's synchronized frequency. The monsters recoiled, their shifting forms momentarily locking into static, frozen positions. "Now," Clara screamed, leaping from the booth and spinning in a whirlwind of motion. She flung the glitter into the air, the reflective particles catching the flickering emergency lights and scattering them in a million chaotic directions. "Look at the composition, look at the contrast. You're not nightmares, you're just bad sketches, you're a smudge, you're a mistake, you're a failed art project." The entities, creatures of pure psychological projection, found themselves unable to maintain their forms. The glitter wasn't just physical. Clara's absolute refusal to acknowledge their terror was acting as a psychic solvent. Every time an entity tried to manifest a horror, Clara countered it with a piece of absurdist commentary, effectively gaslighting the monsters into questioning their own existence. While Arthur provided the muscle and Clara provided the chaos, Elias Vance remained perfectly still. He wasn't fighting, he wasn't screaming, he was observing. His eyes, those burnt-out cigarettes, were scanning the movement of the swarm. He wasn't seeing monsters, he was seeing a system. He saw the way the entities flowed toward the fear of the patrons, the way they coordinated their lunges, the way they relied on the softening of the environment to maintain their physical presence. He saw the logistics of the invasion. "They're not attacking us," Elias said, his monotone voice cutting through the noise. "They're using the other people as a power source. We're just the obstacles in the way of the fuel." He looked at Margaret, who was currently using her flashlight to blind a creature while lecturing it on the importance of proper footwear in a food service. "Environment, Margaret," Elias called out, his voice devoid of emotion. "If we can isolate the fuel source, we can collapse the network. We need to move the civilians. Now." Margaret stopped her lecture and looked at Elias. For the first time, she saw the strategic value in the broken man. "A logistical evacuation," she muttered, her eyes snapping back into administrator mode. "Of course, Arthur, stop pummeling that thing and form a perimeter, Clara. Stop playing with the glitter and start herding the survivors toward the kitchen." The transition was instantaneous. The four of them didn't need a plan, they simply fell into their natural roles. Margaret became the command center, her voice booming across the diner, directing the panicked patrons with a precision that left no room for argument. Her authority was so absolute that the terrified civilians stopped screaming and began to move, driven by the sheer force of her will. "You, in the blue shirt. Grab that woman's hand and move toward the walk-in freezer. Now, do not look back. Move, or I will have you in a nursing home by Monday." Arthur became the vanguard. He stood at the mouth of the kitchen, a wall of sleep-deprived meat and fury. Every time an entity tried to breach the line, Arthur met them with a roar and a series of devastating, uncoordinated strikes that left the creatures reeling. He was no longer a man, he was a guardian beast, his eyes glowing with a feral intensity that made the monsters hesitate. Clara became the disruptor. She circled the perimeter, using her air horn and a variety of absurdist props, including a rubber chicken and a handheld mirror to keep the entities off balance. She was a whirlwind of cognitive dissonance, turning the battle into a surrealist performance piece that left the Hollows psychologically exhausted. And Elias was the closer. He walked calmly through the chaos, his footsteps steady. He approached the largest of the entities, the hive mind coordinator that was anchoring the invasion in the diner. The creature towered over him, its void chest pulsing with a rhythmic, hypnotic light. Elias didn't flinch. He reached into his cardigan and pulled out his spiral-bound notebook. "I've been analyzing your operational costs," Elias said, his voice a flat, dead drone. "The amount of energy you're spending to maintain this physical manifestation in a high-friction environment like a 24-hour diner is staggering. Your ROI is abysmal. You're spending 90% of your psychic capital on a population that is already broken. It's a terrible investment." The entity paused, its shifting face flickering. "In fact," Elias continued, leaning in, his eyes void of everything but a cold, predatory calculation, "I think you're over-leveraged. I think you're bankrupt. And as the primary owner of the vibe in this specific square footage, I'm calling in your debt." Elias didn't use a spell or a weapon. He simply projected his own aggressive apathy, the crushing, hollow feeling of having lost everything, directly into the entity's core. He didn't offer fear, he offered emptiness. The entity, which thrived on the high-energy spikes of terror, was suddenly hit with a wave of absolute stagnant nothingness. It was like trying to feed a fire with liquid nitrogen. The hive mind's form began to shrink, its purple light fading into a dull, grey flicker. "Checkmate," Elias whispered. With a final synchronized push, Margaret's command, Arthur's rage, Clara's chaos, and Elias' void, the four of them exerted a combined psychic pressure that the entities could not withstand. The swarm didn't just retreat, they were repelled, thrown back through the shattered windows in a wave of spectral recoil. As the last of the monsters vanished into the night, silence returned to the blue plate. The patrons were safe in the kitchen, shivering but alive. The four apex humans stood in the wreckage of the diner, covered in glitter, baby puree, and black ichor. They were exhausted, broken, and utterly mismatched. Margaret wiped a smudge of sludge off her clogs and looked at the others. "Well," she said, her voice returning to its administrative clip, "that was a decent start, but I suspect the management of this hollow organization is going to require a much more formal set of guidelines." Arthur let out a long, shaking sigh and leaned against the counter. I just want to go home and sleep for 1,000 years. Not yet, Elias said, looking at the dark city skyline where more pulses of necrotic energy were beginning to ripple. I believe we have some zoning laws to establish. The sky over Oakhaven's town square had ceased to be a ceiling and had become a wound. It was a bruised, iridescent violet, the color of a fresh hematoma, swirling in slow, sickening eddies that defied every law of meteorology. The horizon didn't just meet the earth, it folded. The historic clock tower, a limestone sentinel that had stood for a century, was currently bending at a 45-degree angle, its stone masonry stretching like warm taffy. Cobblestones rippled in slow-motion waves, turning the ground into a grey, stony sea that heaved and sighed with a rhythmic subterranean breath. In the center of the square, the breach had opened. It was not a portal in the traditional sense, but a rupture in the fabric of the three-dimensional world. A jagged, shimmering tier of absolute void hung in the air, 10 stories tall and wide as a city block. From this rift, the hollows were no longer sending scouts. They were pouring through in an architectural tide of geometry and flesh. Great obsidian spires erupted from the pavement, pulsing with a low-frequency hum that turned the air into a vibrating gelatin. Entities the size of cathedrals, composed of interlocking rings of bone and screaming light, drifted through the tier, their presence warping the gravity around them. Cars floated upward, spinning slowly in the air like discarded toys. Storefront windows shattered not from impact, but from the sheer sonic pressure of a world being overwritten. The screaming was a constant white noise backdrop, a symphony of 10,000 citizens realizing that their reality had been revoked. Amidst this apocalypse, the four of them stood on the steps of City Hall, a small, incongruous huddle of humanity against the cosmic storm. Margaret Thorne was no longer wearing her scrubs. She had donned a heavy, navy blue administrative blazer that looked as though it had been armored with starch. In her left hand, she held a megaphone. In her right, a clipboard that now contained a series of meticulously drawn flowcharts and a set of emergency operational guidelines she had drafted on the back of several napkins. The logistics are abysmal, Margaret shouted over the roar of the folding city, her voice amplified by the megaphone into a sharp, commanding crack. Look at that deployment, they're bottlenecking at the fountain. There's no perimeter control, no designated entry points, and the sheer lack of organizational structure is frankly insulting. Beside her, Arthur Penhaligon was in a state of transcendental exhaustion. He had not slept since the blackout began, and he had reached a plateau of delirium where he could now see the wind. He was holding a heavy-duty industrial flashlight in one hand and a length of reinforced nylon rope in the other. His eyes were two red pits of primal intensity, and he was currently chewing on a piece of raw ginger to keep his heart beating. He wasn't looking at the monsters, he was looking at the fleeing crowd. They're too loud, Arthur rasped, his voice a dry rattle. The screaming, it's too high-pitched, it's going to wake the babies. If any of this noise reaches the suburbs, I will dismantle this entire dimension with my bare hands. He stepped forward, his movements jagged and predatory. He didn't fight the entities, he simply intercepted the panicked citizens who were running in the wrong direction, grabbing them by the collars and hurling them toward the safety of the alleyways with a strength that seemed to draw from a hidden subterranean reservoir of parental rage. To the survivors, he looked like a demon of the suburbs, a sleep-deprived wraith who cared nothing for the end of the world, only for the maintenance of silence. Elias Vance stood slightly behind them, his oversized cardigan fluttering in the gravitational winds. He was staring at the obsidian spires erupting from the earth with a look of profound, calculating greed. He had a calculator in one hand and a legal pad in the other. The land value in the square is plummeting, Elias noted, his monotone voice barely audible over the sonic boom of a collapsing building. But the resource extraction potential of that void matter is astronomical. If we can secure the perimeter and establish a customs house, we could effectively tax the invasion. Why fight a war when you can implement a tariff? He looked up at a ringed entity that was currently erasing a nearby bakery from existence. Excuse me, Elias yelled, cupping his hand around his mouth. Do you have a permit for that structural modification? I believe this is a historic district. I'll have the city council on you in an hour. The entity paused, its rings of bone shimmering in confusion. It had never been addressed as a tenant, and then there was Clara. Clara Vale had spent the last hour preparing. She had returned to her studio and emerged wearing a cape made of mirrored shards and a helmet that looked like a repurposed satellite dish. She was carrying a boombox that had been modified with a series of illegal amplifiers and a collection of the most dissonant avant-garde noise recordings ever captured on magnetic tape. "The composition is too monochromatic," Clara screamed, her voice full of theatrical glee. "Too much purple, too much obsidian, it's so grimdark, it's like a teenager's first attempt at a gothic novel. It needs contrast, it needs a pop of color, it needs a revolution of the absurd." She slammed the play button on the boombox. A sound erupted from the speakers that could only be described as a choir of electric chainsaws fighting a symphony of malfunctioning vacuum cleaners. It was a sonic assault of pure, unadulterated chaos, a frequency that didn't just disrupt the Hollow's communication, it mocked it. The effect was immediate. The obsidian spires began to vibrate, their smooth surfaces cracking as they struggled to synchronize with the absurdist noise. The entities, creatures of a singular predatory purpose, were suddenly hit with a wave of cognitive dissonance that made their physical forms flicker and stutter. Margaret saw the opening. She stepped to the edge of the stairs, the megaphone raised like a scepter. "Attention all non-human entities," she bellowed, her voice cutting through the noise and the screams. "I am Margaret, acting chair of the OAKHAVN Containment Committee. You are currently in violation of City Ordinance 402B regarding unlawful assembly and unauthorized dimensional merging." The roar of the breach hesitated. The massive, ringed beings paused in their descent. "As of this moment," Margaret continued, her voice hardening into the tone of a head nurse who had just found a patient eating their gauze, "this square is under administrative lockdown. You will cease all destructive activities immediately. You will form orderly lines. You will present your credentials for inspection. And you will, under no circumstances, make any more noise while the children of this city are attempting to nap." The Hollows, a collective of cosmic predators who had devoured 1,000 worlds, looked upon the four humans. They saw a woman of absolute authority, a man of primal rage, a man of void-like apathy, and a woman of chaotic creativity. For the first time in the history of the Great Harvest, the predators felt a flicker of genuine uncertainty. They had come to break a city, but they had encountered something far more dangerous: a management team. The first entity to challenge the decree was a creature that resembled a living cathedral of translucent ribs. Its face, a swirling vortex of screaming nebulae. It drifted forward, the pavement beneath it liquefying into a pool of obsidian glass. It opened its maw to release a sonic wave of pure existential dread, a sound designed to erase the concept of self from the mind of any sentient being. Margaret Thorne did not flinch. Instead, she reached into her blazer and produced a heavy red rubber stamp and a stack of neon pink forms. "Form 12G, application for dimensional residency," she announced, her voice amplified by the megaphone into a thunderous, bureaucratic command. "You're in the wrong line. This is for permanent residents. Temporary visitors must file a 14B visitor's permit. Do you have a 14B? The entity's sonic wave hit her, but it didn't shatter her mind. To Margaret, the sound of existential dread was merely a louder version of a patient screaming that their jello was the wrong color. She had spent 40 years in the trenches of geriatric care. She was immune to the tantrums of the dying, whether they were human or cosmic. She stepped forward, the rubber soles of her clogs squeak-slapping against the obsidian glass, and slammed the red stamp onto the creature's translucent ribcage with a resounding thump. "DENIED," she barked. "Insufficient documentation. Return to the rift and fill out the application in triplicate. Use blue ink, black ink will not be accepted." The creature recoiled. The stamp mark, a bright red circle that read NON compliant, didn't just sit on its skin, it burned. The entity felt a sudden, crushing weight settle over its consciousness. It wasn't the weight of a physical blow, but the weight of an expectation. The social contract, the rigid, suffocating structure of human bureaucracy, had been forcibly grafted onto its form. For a being of pure, chaotic instinct, the concept of filling out a form was a psychic poison. As the first entity wavered, Elias Vance stepped forward. He was no longer just observing, he was calculating. He had produced a small, portable folding table and a sign that read, OAKHAVN INTRDMENSIONAL zoning and LEASING office. Now then, Elias said, his voice a flat, dead drone that seemed to suck the energy out of the surrounding air. Regarding this rift, it's a significant architectural addition to the square, certainly. However, you failed to file a notice of intent to develop. Furthermore, the atmospheric leakage is causing a severe dip in the local property values. He looked up at the towering, ringed entities that were currently floating above the city hall. I'm prepared to overlook the zoning violations, Elias continued, scribbling something on his legal pad, provided we can agree on a lease. Since you're occupying the central square prime real estate, by the way, the monthly rent will be 4,000 sols per square meter, payable in advance. I accept payment in the form of psychic energy, condensed void matter, or high-yield government bonds. The entities paused. Their collective mind, a hive of predatory efficiency, tried to process the request. They didn't understand rent, they didn't understand property values. But as Elias spoke, the logic of his apathy began to weave itself into their reality. He wasn't fighting them, he was monetizing them. He was turning their invasion into a business transaction. The creatures of the hollows felt their power slipping. They were no longer the harvesters, they were being treated as tenants. The sheer, mundane horror of a lease agreement was more destabilizing than any weapon. And don't think I haven't noticed the noise pollution, Elias added, pointing a thin finger at the screaming choir of the rift. I'll be adding a surcharge for every decibel over 80. This is a quiet neighborhood. While the entities were paralyzed by the prospect of financial ruin, Clara Vale launched the second phase of the Apex Protocol. It's time for the encore, she shrieked. She hit a switch on her boombox and the sound shifted. The dissonant noise vanished, replaced by a high-fidelity, loop-track recording of 1,000 people laughing in a crowded room, layered over the sound of a very loud, very wet slide whistle. Clara began to dance, her mirrored cape reflecting the bruised purple light of the sky in 1,000 chaotic directions. She didn't just move, she performed a series of erratic, avant-garde gestures that defied anatomical logic. "Look at yourselves," she shouted, her voice full of a mocking, theatrical pity. "You're so serious, you're so dark, you're just a bunch of edgy teenagers in a void basement. You're not monsters, you're a cliché, you're an aesthetic failure." She lunged at a nearby entity, a spindly thing with a dozen eyes, and began to critique its form, using her fingers to suggest a better arrangement for its ocular clusters. "Too symmetrical, it's boring, give me some asymmetry, give me a focal point, you're just a smudge of grey in a world of colour." The entity shivered. The laughter and the slide whistles were acting as a psychological solvent, dissolving the entity's sense of dread. It had spent eons being feared, but now it was being mocked. It felt a sensation that was entirely foreign to the hollows. It felt cringe. The cosmic horror was being reduced to a joke, and in the face of genuine, absurdist ridicule, the entity's physical form began to evaporate. The hollows were in a state of total systemic collapse. Their frequency, the frequency of fear, had been completely overwritten. They were being managed by a nurse, taxed by a landlord, and critiqued by an artist. And then there was Arthur. Arthur had reached the final stage of sleep deprivation. He was no longer a man, he was a singular, focused point of primal aggression. He stood at the edge of the rift, his industrial flashlight cutting a beam of white light through the void. He saw the hive mind, the central intelligence of the hollows, beginning to emerge from the tier. It was a colossal, shifting mass of eyes and mouths, a god thing of absolute darkness that intended to swallow the city whole. As the hive mind opened its mouth to let out a scream that would have shattered every bone in a normal human's body, Arthur simply stepped forward. He didn't roar, he didn't scream. He leaned in close to the colossal entity, his bloodshot eyes wide and staring, and he whispered a single sentence. "Shush." The word was not a request, it was a command. It was the shush of a father who had spent 72 hours fighting for a single moment of peace. It was the concentrated essence of every parent who had ever stood over a sleeping infant, fearing the slightest noise would break the spell. The power behind the shush was staggering. It was a wall of protective silence that hit the hive mind like a physical shockwave. The entity, a creature composed of noise and chaos, was suddenly slammed into a state of absolute suffocating stillness. The hive mind froze, its mouths closed, its eyes dimmed. For the first time in its existence, the god of the hollows felt the one thing it had never known, the need to be quiet. Now, Margaret's voice boomed through the megaphone, cutting through the silence with the precision of a surgical strike. Since you've all failed to provide the proper documentation, failed to pay your lease, and failed to maintain a respectful noise level, I am officially declaring this invasion a failure." She stepped forward and slammed her red stamp one final time, not on a creature but onto the very air in front of the rift. "Closed for renovations." The stamp mark expanded. The red circle grew, pulsing with the weight of 1,000 administrative deadlines. It acted as a seal, a rigid, bureaucratic lock that slammed shut over the rupture. The void tier didn't explode or collapse, it simply closed. It folded inward with a sound like a heavy ledger being shut, pulling the remaining entities back into the darkness with a final, pathetic pop. The sky over Oakhaven snapped back from bruised purple to a dull, rainy grey. The clock tower straightened itself. The cobblestones stopped heaving. The silence that followed was not the silence of death, but the silence of a job well done. The four of them stood in the center of the square, the ruins of the city around them. They were covered in ichor glitter and a profound sense of exhaustion. Arthur let out a long, shuddering breath and collapsed onto his back, staring up at the grey clouds. "I'm going home," he whispered. "I'm going to sleep for a month. I'll send you the invoice for the square's cleanup," Elias noted, already scribbling on his legal pad. "I suspect we can bill the void dimension for the damages." Clara looked at the spot where the rift had been and sighed, a bit too abrupt of an ending. "I would have preferred a slow fade to black with a jazz soundtrack." Margaret Thorne looked at her clipboard, checked a box, and then looked at her companions. "Well," she said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. "That was a productive afternoon. Now who's buying the coffee? I believe we have some paperwork to file." The recovery of Oakhaven did not happen with a celebratory parade or a sudden return to normalcy. Instead, the city settled into a state of aggressive equilibrium. The physical scars remained: the cracked pavement of the town square, the leaning limestone of the clock tower that the city council had decided to leave as a modernist landmark, and the lingering scent of ozone that clung to the alleyways after a summer rain. But the psychic atmosphere had shifted. The people of Oakhaven no longer walked quickly past the dark corners of the street. They didn't avoid the basements or fear the sudden flickers of the streetlights. They had seen the void, and they had seen a nurse with a rubber stamp treat it like a delinquent patient. The city had developed a collective, subconscious armor, a residue of the Apex Protocol that made the residents of Oakhaven the most psychologically resilient population on the planet. At St. Jude's Memory Care, the sealed wing was no longer sealed. Margaret Thorne walked down the seafoam green corridor, the rhythmic squeak slap of her clogs now accompanied by a soft, shimmering, translucent presence gliding beside her. The spectral entity, once the Eater of Hope, was now officially the Night Shift Lade. It wore a small, clip-on ID badge that read Gary Volunteer Aid, and it was currently carrying a tray of warm towels and a stack of fresh linens with a precision that would have made a Swiss watchmaker weep. "You're drifting, Gary," Margaret noted without looking up from her chart. 3 inches to the left. "If you clip the corner of the medication cart again, I'm deducting a decade of your afterlife from your break time." The entity let out a low, mournful sound, a sound that had once been a soul-shattering shriek but was now more of a disgruntled sigh. It corrected its trajectory instantly, its spindly fingers tightening around the linens. The ward was running with a clinical efficiency that was bordering on the supernatural. The patients, particularly those with advanced dementia, found the spectral staff strangely comforting. There was something about the silent, gliding presence of a void entity that seemed to soothe the agitation of the elderly. Mrs. Gable, the frequent wanderer, was now routinely guided back to her room by a creature that could phase through walls, ensuring she never missed a meal or a dose of her heart medication. Margaret stopped at the door of room 214. She looked at the room, now a bright, airy sunroom filled with ferns and reclining chairs, and felt a flicker of something that wasn't quite a smile but was certainly a lack of irritation. "Good," she murmured, marking a final check on her clipboard. "Order, absolute, unwavering order." 3 miles away, in the leaning Victorian on the edge of town, Elias Vance sat in his velvet armchair. The house still smelled of wet dogs and ancient tobacco, but the basement was now the most productive area of the property. Elias held a glass of lukewarm tea, staring at a legal document that was written in a shimmering, iridescent ink that seemed to move if you looked at it from the corner of your eye. It was the permanent subdimensional lease agreement, signed by the skin crawler in a series of rhythmic clicks and biological secretions. Below him, in the cellar, the sound of a vacuum cleaner hummed with a rhythmic mechanical intensity. The skin crawler had discovered a profound, almost meditative passion for domestic maintenance. It had found that the act of removing dust from baseboards provided a sense of structured purpose that was far more satisfying than the chaotic pursuit of human fear. The entity had also discovered the joy of laundry. Elias watched as a long, translucent limb emerged from the basement door, holding a perfectly folded pile of white t-shirts. The creature didn't enter the room, it simply placed the laundry on the coffee table with a delicate clicking precision and then vanished back into the shadows. "The folding is a bit tight on the collars," Elias remarked, not looking up from his ledger. "I'll be noting that in your monthly performance review. Also, the gutters need a second pass before the rain hits on Thursday." A low, clicking sound of acknowledgement drifted up from the floorboards. Elias leaned back and closed his eyes. He was still bankrupt in the traditional sense, but he had discovered a new kind of wealth. He owned the only piece of real estate in the world where the squatter did the chores and the rent was paid in the form of a perfectly maintained home. He had turned his existential void into a service-based economy, and for the first time in years, the silence of the house didn't feel like a weight. It felt like an asset. In the suburbs, the silence was even more profound. Arthur Penhaligon was currently experiencing a sleep so deep it could have been classified as a coma. He was sprawled across the master bedroom, his limbs tangled in a duvet, his breathing a slow, rhythmic tide. He had slept for 14 hours straight, and when he finally woke, he did so with a start, his eyes snapping open with a reflexive, guardian instinct. He looked to his left. The twins were fast asleep in their cribs, their breathing synchronized and peaceful. And standing in the corner of the room, half merged with the shadows, was a tall, blurred figure. The tall man didn't move, it didn't project dread. It didn't try to whisper secrets of the void. Instead, it stood like a sentinel, its featureless face turned toward the bedroom door, its long, spindly limbs folded in a posture of absolute vigilance. The entity had realized that the only way to survive in the presence of Arthur Penhaligon was to become an extension of his will. It had transitioned from a predator to a bodyguard. It now spent its nights scanning the perimeter of the nursery for any sound, a floorboard creak, a distant dog bark, a whisper of wind that might disturb the infants. If a sound occurred, the entity would neutralize it with a swift, silent efficiency, ensuring that the silence of the room remained inviolate. Arthur looked at the creature and let out a long, slow exhale. He didn't feel the need to punch it. He didn't feel the need to roar. He simply reached out and patted the nightstand. "Good boy," Arthur muttered, his voice thick with sleep. The tall man flickered once, a gesture of profound, spectral pride, and then returned to its watch. Finally, in the textile mill, the air was filled with the scent of fresh paint and expensive champagne. Clara Vale's first solo exhibition, titled The Geometry of the Absurd, was the most talked-about event in the city's history. The gallery was packed with critics, socialites, and confused art historians, all of them staring in stunned silence at the canvases. The paintings were unlike anything Oakhaven had ever seen. They were swirling vortexes of gold glitter, neon-pink splatters, and jarring, dissonant shapes that seemed to shift and move as the viewer walked past them. Some of the pieces weren't paintings at all, but interactive installations, sculptures of rusted rebar that emitted the sound of a slide whistle whenever someone stepped too close. In the center of the room stood the piece de Resistance, a massive, iridescent sculpture that looked like a frozen ripple in the air, captured in a complex web of mirrored glass and acrylic. "The artist's use of negative space is daring," one critic whispered, leaning in close. "It evokes a sense of profound existential dread, yet it's tempered by a whimsical, almost childlike disregard for the laws of physics. It's a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance." Clara stood nearby, wearing a dress made of holographic fabric and a pair of oversized drafting goggles pushed up onto her forehead. She was sipping champagne and watching the critics with a look of amused detachment. Beside her, a shimmer in the air flickered. The echo, now a permanent fixture of her studio and a silent collaborator in her work, manifested as a faint, iridescent ripple. It didn't mimic voices anymore, it simply provided a subtle harmonic accompaniment to the conversations in the room, adding a layer of surrealist ambience to the evening. "See, echo," Clara whispered, her eyes gleaming. "I told you the asymmetry was the key." They love the dissonance. They're not seeing a demon, they're seeing a bold aesthetic choice. The ripple in the air shivered with a sense of profound artistic fulfillment. The entity had found a new purpose. It no longer fed on fear, it fed on the admiration of the bourgeois. It had discovered that being a provocative piece of conceptual art was far more sustainable than being a harbinger of the apocalypse. As the evening wound down, the four of them met one last time at the Blue Plate. The diner had been rebuilt, the chrome polished to a mirror finish, and the shattered windows replaced with reinforced, soundproofed glass. They sat in a corner booth, a small, mismatched group of humans who had looked into the mouth of a god and told it to get a job. "I've been thinking," Margaret said, her voice returning to its administrative clip as she looked over a new set of charts. "The City Council is considering a formal partnership with the interdimensional service sector. We could potentially integrate the spectral entities into the waste management and healthcare systems on a permanent basis. I'm already drafting the tax codes for the void matter imports," Elias noted, his monotone voice sounding almost content. "The revenue projections are staggering. I'm planning a second exhibition," Clara added, her eyes sparkling. "I want to explore the theme of bureaucratic horror. I think we can really push the boundaries of what a permit looks like." Arthur didn't say anything. He just leaned back in the vinyl booth and closed his eyes, a small, peaceful smile on his face. For the first time in years, he wasn't listening for a baby's cry. He was just listening to the sound of his friends talking. They were the apex humans of Oak Haven. They hadn't saved the world through magic or heroism or a sudden awakening of the human spirit. They had saved it through the most powerful forces the species had ever developed. A strict schedule, a legal contract, a love for the absurd, and the primal, unrelenting need for a good night's sleep. The Hollows had come to Earth to find a harvest. Instead, they had found a management team. And as far as the entities were concerned, the paperwork was far more terrifying than the void. 6 months after the breach, a new frequency rippled through the grey, humming void of the Hollows. This was not the frantic, shattered distress signal of a scout, but the cold, rhythmic pulse of an auditor. In the hierarchy of the transdimensional collective, an auditor was a creature of absolute purity and singular purpose. It did not haunt, it did not mimic, it did not feed on fear. It was a living algorithm of erasure, a towering pillar of white noise and obsidian geometry designed to cleanse failed colonies. When an auditor arrived, it didn't simply destroy the inhabitants. It erased the very memory of the place from the cosmic record, folding the space back into the void as if it had never existed. The auditor descended upon Oak Haven on a Tuesday, choosing the moment when the afternoon rain was turning the streets into shimmering ribbons of slate and silver. It manifested in the center of the town square, a monolithic spire of shifting ivory plates that groaned with the sound of grinding tectonic plates. Around it, the air crystallized into floating shards of glass, and a wave of absolute sterile silence washed over the city. This was the erasure field, a psychic vacuum that stripped away emotion, identity, and will, leaving the victims as hollow shells before they were folded into nothingness. Under normal circumstances, the city would have fallen in seconds. The inhabitants would have stood frozen, their eyes vacant, waiting for the fold. But as the auditor's field expanded, it encountered something it had never encountered in 1,000 harvests. It didn't hit a wall of resistance, it hit a wall of habit. A woman in a yellow raincoat carrying a bag of groceries walked directly through the edge of the erasure field. She didn't stop, she didn't lose her identity. Instead, she paused, looked up at the towering spire of obsidian and ivory, and frowned. "For heaven's sake," she muttered, her voice echoing in the sterile silence. "Another one of these things. I just got my flower beds replanted." The auditor's plates shifted violently, a sound like 1,000 guillotines falling at once. It projected a surge of pure, blinding void energy, a command for the woman to cease existing. The woman didn't cease. She simply stepped around the energy flare, checked her watch, and continued walking toward the pharmacy. The auditor froze, its algorithm stuttered. The erasure field was functioning perfectly, yet the biological matter of the city was refusing to acknowledge it. The softening that usually preceded a harvest had been replaced by a hardened collective callous. The people of Oak Haven had lived with ghosts in their basements and demons in their studios for half a year. They had reached a state of existential saturation. To them, a cosmic erasure event was simply another urban inconvenience, a glitch in the municipal infrastructure. The auditor, sensing a systemic failure, attempted to locate the source of this anomaly. It scanned the city, its sensors searching for the focal point of the resistance. It found it at a small chrome-trimmed diner on the corner of Main and Elm. The auditor shifted its form, collapsing its monolithic spire into a more concentrated humanoid shape, a slender, featureless entity of polished white marble, its head a single floating ring of gold. It glided toward the blue plate, the pavement cracking beneath its feet, the air around it screaming with the force of its purity. It passed through the front door of the diner, the bell chiming with a cheerful, mundane ting. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the cosmic void. The air smelled of sizzling bacon, burnt coffee, and the faint, lingering scent of rubbing alcohol. In the corner booth, the four of them were gathered. Margaret Thorne was reviewing a set of payroll documents. Elias Vance was calculating the depreciation value of a void spire. Clara Vale was sketching a portrait of a screaming void entity wearing a party hat. And Arthur Penhaligon was staring blankly into a cup of black coffee, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and rhythmic. The auditor stood before them, its gold ring pulsing with an intense, blinding light. It didn't speak, it projected a command of absolute submission, a psychic weight that should have crushed their spines and forced them to their knees. Margaret didn't look up from her papers. "You're late for the appointment," she said, her voice a sharp, administrative snap. "The 3:00 p.m. slot for interdimensional grievances was 20 minutes ago. I don't care if you're an auditor, my time is not a suggestion." The entity's light flickered. It shifted its frequency, intensifying the pressure, attempting to find a crack in the armor. Elias leaned back in his seat, his expression one of profound, aggressive boredom. "Look, if you're here about the property taxes on the town square, you'll have to take it up with the city council. I've already filed a motion to reclassify the rift as a non-taxable ecological preserve. It's a legal loophole, very clever, I did it myself." The auditor's form began to vibrate, a high-pitched whine emanating from its marble skin. It was experiencing something it had no programming for: frustration. Clara leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a manic creative intensity. "Oh, I love the look, the white marble, the gold ring, it's very neoclassical void. It's almost too clean though, it lacks a certain grit. If you're going to erase the city, you really should start with a more provocative color palette. Maybe a deep, bruised ochre." The entity's gold ring spun violently, a scream of pure, distilled energy erupting from its core. The diner began to shake, the coffee cups rattling on the counters, the windows humming with the force of the erasure. Arthur finally looked up. He didn't move, he didn't shout, he simply looked at the auditor with eyes that had seen the bottom of a 72-hour wake cycle. There was a look in his gaze that the auditor recognized, not as a threat but as a mirror. It was the look of something that had already been erased. It was the look of a man who had given everything to the void and found that the void was actually quite small compared to a screaming toddler. "Be quiet," Arthur whispered. The whisper didn't travel through the air, it traveled through the foundations of the city. It was a command of absolute parental stillness. The auditor's energy vanished. The humming stopped. The gold ring ceased its spinning and hung limp in the air. The entity stood there, frozen, its marble skin dulling to a matte grey. It had encountered the ultimate apex of human evolution, the point where a person becomes so exhausted that they are no longer affected by the laws of the universe. Margaret finally looked up from her clipboard. She looked at the auditor, then at her watch. "Since you've wasted our time and disrupted the lunch rush," Margaret announced, her voice regaining its terrifying maternal simmer, "you are hereby appointed as the interim director of public works for Oak Haven. Your first task is to fix the potholes on 4th Street and ensure the sewage system is cleared of all residual void ichor. You will report to me every Monday at 8:00 a.m. for a performance review." The auditor did not fight, it did not scream. It simply stood there, the weight of 1,000 Monday morning meetings settling over its cosmic consciousness. It realized with a sudden crushing clarity that there was no erasing a place like this. Oakhaven wasn't a colony to be harvested, it was a bureaucracy to be endured. The entity turned and glided out the door, its movements no longer graceful but heavy, as if it were carrying an invisible stack of filing cabinets. As the door closed, the four of them sat in silence for a moment. "I think he'll be a quick learner," Margaret noted, marking a checkbox on her clipboard. "He has a very structured way of moving. I'll charge him a consulting fee for the onboarding process," Elias added, his voice returning to its monotone drone. I'm going to paint him as a very sad accountant, Clara whispered, her pencil already flying across the paper. Arthur didn't say a word. He simply leaned his head back against the vinyl booth and closed his eyes, drifting back into a deep, undisturbed sleep. Outside, the rain continued to fall over Oakhaven, washing the glitter and the ichor into the gutters. The city remained, leaning, scarred, and utterly absurd. It was a place where the monsters did the laundry and the gods filed incident reports. It was a testament to the enduring, stubborn nature of the human spirit, and the terrifying truth that the only thing more frightening than a cosmic horror was a woman with a rubber stamp and a schedule to keep. The void had tried to consume them, but in the end, the humans had simply integrated it into the city's operational budget. And as the sun set over the bruised purple horizon, the people of Oakhaven went home to their families, their basements, and their perfectly managed nightmares, knowing that as long as Margaret Thorne held the clipboard, the universe would simply have to wait its turn.
We hope you enjoyed listening and invite you to join us again next rotation for another story from Amy Surratt's Tales from Tomorrow.